Our text is from Acts chapter 1, as Pastor Micah just read. I'm not going to be showing any verses on the screen, so if you'd like to follow along, and there's a Bible near you, one of our church Bibles, Acts chapter 1, can be found on page 909. Page 909. As we open up God's Word, as we turn to our text, two preliminary questions, a what and a why. The first question is, what actually is this book of Acts? What is the book of Acts? Well, the book of Acts was written by the Apostle Luke, who was a companion of the Apostle Paul, went on several of his missionary journeys. The Apostle Luke is, of course, the one who wrote what's called the Gospel according to Luke, and that is a historical narrative of the birth and the life and the ministry and the suffering and the death and the resurrection and the ascension of Christ. So the Gospel of Luke is the history of Jesus Christ, his birth, life, ministry, suffering, death, resurrection, ascension. And then the book of Acts is a companion volume, not focusing now on the life of Christ or the history of Jesus, but the book of Acts focuses on the history of the earliest days and years of Christianity, of the church. Following from the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus over a span of about 30 years, and the essence of the book, the major plot line of the story, is the spreading of the message of Jesus, his love and his hope from Jerusalem. And spoiler alert, it goes all the way to the great city of Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire. The book of Acts is a history of the earliest days of the church. It was written by the Apostle Luke somewhere around 60 AD. That's just 30 years from the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And as we go through the narrative over the course of 15 weeks here this fall, we'll see as we get nearer and nearer to the end, Luke is now actually writing events, things that took place just maybe 2 years earlier. Writing just 2 years from the time these things happened. Of course, well within the lifetime of people who were there, who were eyewitnesses, Luke himself as an eyewitness. And so what we have here is the history of the early church. What the book of Acts is not, is that it's not mythology. And it's not simply like a legend that grew and developed over hundreds of years. Sometimes people think that way. No, not at all. This is eyewitness historical accounts of the earliest days and moments of the church. And there's even non-Christian historians who look at Luke and see him as one of the great historians of the ancient world. And we're going to see this. We're going to see stunning detail as we go through these 15 weeks of people and places, of geography and topography and distances and local customs and even Roman judicial proceedings. All of this in stunning exact detail, which lends to the credibility and the trustworthiness of Luke as a historian of the Acts of the Apostles, the history of the church, the earliest days. That's what the book of Acts is. Now, why? Why are we focusing on it here at Our Father for 15 weeks, the whole course of the fall, as I said? Well, the why is this. Because over the next month or so, we're going to be hearing more about the future of our congregation. We're going to be hearing more about where God might be leading us over the next 10 years. We're looking to 2036, and we're going to be looking at the next 2 to 3 years. We're going to be looking at just the year that's before us in 26 and 27. And so as we're focusing on the future of our congregation, of our family here, we thought it good to look back to the past, to the earliest moments of the church. What can we learn? And really, how can we see Jesus even more clearly? So if you're a guest here, If you're a person here or online who's exploring Christianity, this might seem sort of like an inside church kind of conversation, but it is a really good thing that you're here, guest, a person exploring Christianity, because it means you get to learn more about us. You really are going to have a chance to learn about the church and Christianity, most importantly, to learn more about Jesus and the hope and the love that can transform your life. So that's the preliminary questions. That's the what, that's the why. As we turn to the text itself, we see here in the very first opening chapter and verses, Jesus has risen, he is alive. And if you're following along, it says this in Acts chapter 1, verse 3, that Jesus, quote, presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days. So what is that saying? That's saying that Jesus was with his people, his followers, for 40 days after his resurrection. And he's giving them, and other translations say it this way, quote, many convincing proofs that he actually was alive. Extraordinary, 40 days. He gives them the best Bible study and seminary education you could imagine over the course of those 40 days. And then we see an interesting juxtaposition, an interesting contrast here between the size of the mission that he gives to the church and the size of the church itself. If you're following along, verse 8, this is the mission, the size and the scope of the mission that Jesus sends his people on. It says this, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and he says, to the end of the earth. You see the size and the scope of the mission of Jesus. All hail King Jesus that we just sang. He's sending them from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the end of the earth. It is a global mission. He is sending them out and saying, transform and change the world in my name. Now, that's the size and scope of the mission, but it's almost comical. Because look at the size of the church itself. We see this in verse 15. It says, in those days, Peter stood up among the brothers and sisters, and the company of persons was in all about 120. That's it. That's Christianity. That's the entire church. It's 120 men and women, maybe even including children, not sure. But it's almost laughable, as I said. He says, go out and to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth, 120 men and women. Go and transform the world. We see the contrast. But here's the thing. The extraordinary thing. As simply a fact of history, that's exactly what happened. That in a little over 200 years from the time that Luke is writing this history of the earliest days of the church, in just a little over 200 years, Christianity emerges under oppression, under sometimes the most cruel and unimaginable persecution and all of the violence. It emerges just a little over 200 years from the time that Luke is writing to become the dominant cultural force in the Roman Empire. And the world is changed. Literally, in just a few short 100 years after this time, millions and millions and millions of people are swept up into this movement of Jesus, into this love and this hope that is radically transformative of themselves, their families, and civilization. From these 120, the question is, how did that happen? I'll tell you how it didn't happen. It wasn't at the end of a sword. It wasn't a military conquest like some other religions. It wasn't through violence or coercion or force or military strength. We think, well, boy, these 120 must have been very elite, very well-connected people and had some connections. No. The exact opposite. These people are marginalized, tiny little group. These people are, we would call peasants, some slaves, uneducated, unimportant, nobodies in the eyes of the elite and the world. And yet the world, the Roman world, was changed. How did that happen? What did they have? What kind of power did they have that brought such an unimaginable change and a fulfillment of the mission of Jesus? Well, I think we see at least the hint of an answer to that here in the very first verse, Acts chapter 1, verse 1, where again the Apostle Luke is writing, and he says, "In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach." In the first book, O Theophilus. Now, this is a person, Theophilus. It literally means lover of God. The way that Luke is addressing him here and also in the book of Acts, most excellent Theophilus, we believe that this very well could have been a Roman official who was supporting the work of Luke and kind of his patron, and so he's honoring him and thanking him here in these opening lines. In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach, but the primary focus is on what Jesus has done. And again, what's the first book? That's the Gospel according to Luke. The Gospel according to Luke, which tells, again, the history, the story of the birth and the life and the ministry and the suffering, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. In the first book, Theophilus, I wrote down all that Jesus began to do. I'm writing, I'm focused. What I'm giving to you is the facts of the reality of what Jesus has done. God coming into this world for you. In other words, what Luke is not saying here is this. In my first book, the Gospel according to Luke, O Theophilus, I wrote down all of the secret wisdom of Jesus, the special knowledge of Jesus that you can learn from. In my first book, O Theophilus, I wrote down all of the spiritual advice Jesus gave of how to find enlightenment for yourself. See, he's not saying that. In my first book, O Theophilus, I wrote down all the wonderful spiritual advice and practical tips on how to live your best life now and how to gain spiritual bliss. He's not writing that. He says, I wrote down first and foremost the actual things that Jesus did, his actions. And he calls this, and the church called this story and the history of Jesus, they called it a gospel. You've heard that, right? So we got the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark, the gospel according to John, the gospel according to Luke. Written down, but also orally proclaimed as well, the gospel. Now, what does the word gospel mean? It's an English word. It's sort of a strange word, gospel. Gospel, and again, we're focusing on what the church had and their power that transformed the world. The word gospel in English comes from the Old English word godspell. Godspell over time became gospel. And godspell is an Old English word, god, which meant good, and spell, which meant story or account, a narrative, or news. Gospel is literally the good account, the good message, the good news of what God has actually done and is doing in time and space and human history on behalf of you. And gospel, good news, was their translation of the original Greek word that's used throughout the New Testament, which is this: euangelion. Euangelion. Say that after me. Euangelion. Euangelion. We get words like evangelical actually comes from that. Evangelist. Euangelion, two words put together. Eu meaning good. Angelion, we hear the word angel or angel, which are the messengers of God. The good message, the good news. Euangelion, God spell gospel. The good news of what God has done. Now, we actually hear Luke records in Luke chapter 2, the angels themselves, that very first Christmas there in Bethlehem, and the shepherds were afraid there in the field. And the angel of the Lord said to them, what? Do not be afraid. That God's angels and messengers would say to you, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. I bring you a euangelion. I bring you good news of great joy that is for all the people. There is a euangelion, there is a gospel, a gospel, good news that can bring great joy in the midst of your fear. And it's for all the people, it's for you. And this is what the church had. The good news. And some of you look disappointed. Oh, they changed the world and millions of people, and I thought it was going to be some cool secret thing we could do. Sorry. It's the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, which changed individuals and families and cities and civilizations, the world. Now, this term, euangelion, was not invented by Christians or even, the angel uses the term, but it was a term that was used for centuries before Jesus was ever on the earth. A euangelion, this idea of a good news that would be proclaimed, is something that was for centuries in the Roman world and in the Greek world. Sometimes, maybe oftentimes, used like for a military victory. So if your army defeated your enemy's army, you would send a person with the euangelion, you would send an evangelist, if you will, to proclaim the good news of the victory that your people had been saved from defeat and from the enemy. Maybe some of you have heard of the story of the Battle of Marathon. This was around 490 BC, and you had the city-state of Athens in the region of Greece, and you had the dreaded Persian Empire, and the Persian army was invading and going to attack the city of Athens. They would have destroyed the city, burned it to the ground. You take the women, you take the children, and it's a nightmare and a horror we can't even imagine. So the people of Athens send their army, the Athenian army, about 40 kilometers, about 25, 26 miles north to a place called Marathon. And that's where they engaged in a great and terrible battle with the Persian Empire, and the Athenian army was victorious. And so as the story goes, they took a runner, a young man, and they gave him this euangelion, the good news that they had been saved and they were victorious from their dreaded enemies. And he ran the 40 kilometers, he ran 25, 26 miles from Marathon all the way to the city of Athens. He proclaims this euangelion, the good news, the gospel, the gospel of their victory over the Persian Empire, and he drops dead. Which is why I don't run. Hardly ever. He ran 25 miles with the good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, the Apostle Paul would later write. And notice again, he didn't run 25 miles and drop over dead in the process simply to announce to them, hey everyone, listen up. I have the most wonderful advice for you on how to live your life. Listen up, everyone. I have the most wonderful information that's really going to help you live your best life, even if the Persians take us over. Listen up, everyone. I got some wonderful tips. No. He ran and ran because of the overwhelming good news of the victory of salvation. And the early church said, this is what we have. The ultimate euangelion, good news of salvation, of victory over all of the spiritual forces of evil and darkness and sorrow and brokenness and death. The gospel, that's what they had, the good news of a God. If I can share the good news with you here this morning, maybe some of you have never heard it. We always need to hear it again. A God who came down. God's always been a God who comes down, and God came down to Adam and Eve. God came down to Moses in the burning bush. God came down as a pillar of fire and a cloud, leading the Israelites. He came down into the tabernacle and the temple in Jerusalem. God came down 2,000 years ago as a human being. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. Think of that. God who can seem so remote and far away and infinite and huge, and he became so small and vulnerable. God purposely puts himself in an ontological reality of being in a situation that could be hurt, that could be harmed, that could be wounded, that could be killed. He's taken, he's beaten, he's punched, he's spit on, he is crucified. In the Roman Empire, crucifixion was the punishment for a slave. God taking on the form of a slave. He is literally stripped and exposed, and not only the physical, but the spiritual suffering. Have you ever felt guilty before? Imagine all of the guilt and shame of every human being that ever has, does, or will live all at the same time. He suffered hell. All of the sorrows and sadnesses and tears he took within himself. He died, he breathed his last, he said, it is finished. They placed him in the tomb. But 3 days later, the stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty. Jesus appeared to them for a period of 40 days, giving them many convincing proofs that he was alive. And literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people saw him alive. And like at least 1 million people who were there in Jerusalem for the Passover were there when the moment when the sun stopped shining at noon and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, and all of the earthquakes that took place. These things weren't done in a corner or in secret. They were known, and the news of this spread from one person to another person, and one family to another family, and in less or a little over 200 years from when Luke is writing, Christianity emerges, and there's millions and millions of people now living with hope in a hopeless and weary world. That's what they had. That's the power. Let me wrap up by saying this. Paul, later on, again, Paul and Luke were companions, traveling companions, and Paul wrote a letter to now this church that's in Rome, in the capital of the Roman Empire. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, he says, I am not ashamed of the euangelion. I'm not ashamed of the good news, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Notice what he says is there, again, as we wrap up. He says the gospel, the euangelion, the good news, this goad spell gospel, it isn't simply adjacent to the power of God or sort of sometimes connected to the power of God. He says the gospel, the good news, is the power of God. Take this, for example. Look at the beauty, look how simple, look how small, ghost pepper. Seems pretty innocent, seems pretty tame, and you can observe it from the outside and kind of know of it, but if you take a ghost pepper and you ingest it and take it within you, there is a power and there is a change and there is a transformation. Now, this isn't a very happy illustration, I realize, but the gospel, the good news, it is the power of God, and it's hope, and it's love. And we'll see over the next 15 weeks it changing individuals and families and communities and the world. There's a lot of bad news in the world today. There is so much bad news. But we have good news. We have the ultimate good news, and his name is Jesus, crucified and risen for you. He just wants you today to know you are forever loved and wanted. To him alone, to Christ alone, be all the glory. Amen.